This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Welcome to Confronting the Line, where we discuss the world of personal development and the sometimes fraught line between exploitation and transformation. My name is Mark Tafoya. I'm here with Ann L. Peterson, author of the book, Is This a Cult?, which examines that question for herself. Hi, Ann. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a big examination. Still is. I think I'm still in the early stages. I'm still trying to answer the question.
Probably a question that will always be a question. We are here today with Dr. John Hunter, who is a PhD, and he's written a lot about large group awareness trainings. And we had a wonderful conversation with him in our previous episode. So if you haven't seen that episode, pause here and go back to the previous episode. Welcome back, John.
Hi, how are you doing?
We're doing really good. Yeah. So in our last episode, you gave us a wonderful sort of background in like your personal experience and your history of being a person with bipolar disorder, and then being really committed to studying it and learning for yourself as a means of dealing with it and coping with it. Kind of what are all the things I need to look out for, and then how you sort of fell into attending a seminar, which made you really start to question, hey, is this something that's going to impact me in my disorder? And then how does this work? How is this working? How are they doing this? What's happening here? And then that led to you actually going and formally studying and getting a PhD. So we learned all about that in part one. And now we want to continue our conversation.
Well, it's really interesting because I had, in my daughter's journey, one time I had an evaluation done on her when she was still a teenager because she was having a lot of problems in school and whatnot. Anyway, a very well-known psychologist evaluated this report I had done on her, and he actually, I can still picture it. He drew this diagram for me, and it's like a rectangle and it has like an X in it. And he basically explained that we're always teeter-tottering between depression and mania. Like at the one side is mania, those kinds of things you described, and at the low side is depression, and that all of us to some degree are kind of teetering back and forth, but most of us are teetering like this, just a little up and down, most often in response to lifestyle, to diet, to all kinds of things, and we're kind of like up and down all day long, every day. And then for some of us, we get either, I've heard chemical imbalances or life situations or whatnot that'll kind of tip the teeter-totter harder, and it'll tip as COVID. We're seeing so much stuff coming out of COVID as people get back into life. And anyway, so I just found that all really, really interesting. And I really appreciated what you said about the stigma that is often associated with these conditions, and that it's sort of considered a bad thing. I don't actually consider mental illness a bad thing. I consider, we now have neurodivergence and all that, but I consider it's like, oh, there's an imbalance just like in my body somewhere. I don't know why there's all the stigma around mental stuff other than, I don't know, makes us feel safer.
I think it's one of those things when there's a lack of understanding about something, then often like stigma's the natural response, or fear's the natural response. I think something that you're saying that's very relevant, that idea that most of us kind of are moving between, I wouldn't say the mood spectrum is broad. So if this is depression and this is mania, I mean, most people have got kind of this sort of range of mood. You said people can have different neurobiological makeups and different vulnerabilities. So some people are more susceptible to maybe becoming high or becoming very low. I think there was his name Alan, a person who was on one of your previous episodes. He mentioned Viktor Frankl. And I mean, that's that book, Man's Search for Meaning. He speaks about being in a concentration camp, or a number of concentration camps, and how the people that went through it, some people came out of it very well and some people didn't. And a lot of it had to do with the sense of purpose or meaning or whatever that they had. He developed something called logotherapy. But there's a a very important line from that book that I think relates to large group awareness trainings is Frankl says, an abnormal response to an abnormal situation is normal. And what I think goes on in a large group awareness training is that they create a very abnormal situation. So you have normal people that are responding in a way that would normally be restricted to people that maybe are experiencing a mood episode or something like that. But because it's such an extreme situation, the body responds in an extreme way. So just to bring up Viktor Frankl again, I think that's a line that I prefer. I think it's a really important line because sometimes it can just be a situation that you put in abnormal level of stress, and your body is trying to keep you in balance, and there's this abnormal defense against that stress, which may be experienced as an elevated state.
Some people call that like nervous laughter, right? Like if you're in a really uncomfortable environment and then you start laughing and people go, that's weird. That's an abnormal response, right? But you're very uncomfortable because it's a weird situation. So it's expected that someone might have that kind of reaction, maybe. Yeah. Is that an example of it on a small level?
I mean, another simple example would be, not to use a crass example, but like autoerotic asphyxiation. You're doing something extreme to yourself, and there's a high that comes from it, but it's because of a restriction of something, and then suddenly a flood as a result of your body fighting to kind of keep you alive, and it feels really good. So I'm not necessarily saying that that's exactly what's going on in LGAT, but I think that the analogy is valid, that you've got an extreme situation, your body's trying to defend you from that extreme situation. And, you know, if you've seen some of my the other podcasts, I speak about the dopaminergic defense and how dopamine can be a very useful defense against feelings like guilt, shame, inadequacy, fear, which might be heightened during an LGAT. And so if you've got an elevation of dopamine signaling, you start feeling things like euphoria, confidence, energy, motivation, often decisiveness, those sorts of things. And then in extreme cases, you start seeing psychosis, which has been reported as a result of participation in various LGATs. And obviously it's not every person. It seems to happen not frequently, but sometimes. But those are the people that are particularly vulnerable to the environment.
Well, I think there's something also about, we used to call it the group dynamic, but if you're having, two things about that I think are interesting. If you're having kind of an extreme experience or a heightened experience, but you're having it with a group of people, all kinds of things, it's normal. So like if I'm at a concert, for example, and, you know, we're down in the pit and we're rocking out and, you know, all kinds of stuff, you know, become things that we wouldn't ordinarily do, you know, flashing, you know, like all the stuff we do. And we're doing it in part because of the environment has that kind of elevated, more extreme emotionality feel not just normal, but it's like the thing to do. It's called for. It's like being demanded.
And we're all banging our heads at the same rhythm together, and we see each other. Like, yeah, you too, me too, right on. You know,
it's catching, and so there's all of that. And Chris Shelton was sharing with me what I think is just an absolutely brilliant point recently. Hopefully, he and I are going to get together and have a longer conversation about it. But he was sharing about how these gurus, these leaders, Henley, Earhart, Hubbard, you know, these gurus and these trainers that rely on experience, creating an experience to create transformation. He was remarking how, you know, it's like almost too simple for us complex minds, but if somebody puts you, if there's a system or a process or a series of activities that put you, a group, in a heightened experience, and then they tell you what that experience is, they fill in, they go, oh, that's transformation. That's getting it. That's popping. Ooh, you popped in that experience. You'll go, I did? Tell me more. And then people go, well, you just had a breakthrough. You just had a transformation. What was the transformation you had? And you'll go, well, let me think. I mean, I've done this. And you'll go, oh, well, actually, da 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 da, and you'll create something right there in that moment, because you want to hold the experience, you want to explain the experience, you want to in that moment, and then that is what you're left with. That's why I think you can go through 3 days of what is essentially torture, sitting in the most uncomfortable chair, in the most uncomfortable room, in the most uncomfortable and confusing conversations for hours on end. And you forget all of that. It's kind of like childbirth, by the way, gentlemen. You go through 18 hours of extreme pain, but in the end, what you remember is the baby.
Yeah.
Well, plus they stick around. But it really is true. If we fully remembered childbirth as it was, trust me, I've gone through it twice. I actually did try to get out of it the second time. I tried to get them to schedule me for a cesarean and they wouldn't do it. But, you remember, your brain sticks with that thing that was decided at the high. And to Chris's point, these groups are filling that in. That's transformation. That's getting
Well,
it.
I think that the point that you are making is very true. It's something that I write about in my PhD. There's something called the peak end rule that Daniel Kahneman speaks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So, very well-known book on psychology. He was a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist. And he spoke about the peak end rule. And this is the idea that and he also speaks about it in the same breath as the experiencing versus the remembering self. So you've got these two selves, the person that experiences something and then the one that remembers it, and they are different. And we tend to remember things how they are at the peak and how they are at the end. And so this is really relevant in large group awareness trainings, I think, because in my seminar and in all the LGATs that I've looked at, one of the rules is you can't write anything down. And that's quite an important thing, because while you are going through whatever you're going through, you might write down, the trainer said something that I didn't really like, or, there was something unpleasant, and you are recording those things. And then afterwards, you can go back and have an objective look at what your experience was. But if you aren't writing anything down, particularly if there's a huge amount of information and you're quite tired and there's homework and you're a little bit sleep deprived, and then right at the end, you are put into this elevated state where you feel better than you've ever felt before, you're going to remember the experience based on that. You're not going to remember any of the negative that might have happened. In my seminar, I was there while this guy was screaming at people. And I spoke to these two women that were in the seminar with me a couple of days afterwards. And I said, well, what did you think of it? And they said it was the greatest thing ever. And I said, do you remember when you're standing, like less than a foot away from that woman? She was in her 60s, quite a timid lady. She had like a crucifix around her neck. I remember this well. And he was screaming at her about, she hadn't changed her chair. She was supposed to sit in a different chair after the break. And so she didn't do that. And now he was screaming at her. And I could see these women that I was speaking to kind of remembering the event. So they had this feeling about what they had been through, but it didn't really line up with what had actually happened. So I do think that that's an important point that you're making on the point of the experience being relatively subjective and the environment kind of saying this is what that experience was. The average delay between first symptoms and diagnosis in bipolar disorder is about 8 years. You would never think that was the case. You think it should be so clear. It's these extreme highs and these extreme lows. It should be diagnosed immediately. It's quite a difficult thing to diagnose. So when somebody's experiencing hypomania for the first time, they don't think to themselves, oh, I must have hypomania. They think I'm having a religious experience, or I'm having some sort of, they've got some sort of explanatory framework that they're explaining to themselves with. So what goes on in a large group awareness training, my view is that the indicators look very similar, if not identical, to hypomania, which is not as extreme as mania. It's not as problematic. Generally, it just feels really, really good. But you've also got somebody, as you say, saying, this is what that experience is. So somebody doesn't have to work it out for themselves. They're like, okay, you telling me that it's a transformation or a breakthrough or whatever, that's a nice way of thinking of it. And I can also understand why, if I'm saying that it's got something to do with bipolar disorder, which is a stigmatized disorder, there may be a lot of people that have had no long-term issues as a result of participating. It might have been a great thing. It might have been a catalyst for them to change and do something great in their lives. They may be very resistant to kind of going, maybe this is the same as that, or in some way, because that's a negative way of thinking about something positive that they've been through, and there may be no use for them to do it like that. I think that the important thing to kind of recognize, and we've sort of spoken about this a little bit, is that you can't just count all the positive results. So if it is a hypermanic type of episode that sometimes becomes a little bit manic, and people become decisive, and they make great big decisions, and they get the new job, or they ask for the raise, or they do whatever, and they tell the person that they love them, that's amazing. But you can't, if you're going to be honest with yourself, only look at that and not look at the potential flip side to that, where somebody does something they take a chance and it doesn't pay off. So I think that's just something to think about. Yeah.
Well, and that's one of the big, so this is a perfect segue into our, God, I could just talk to Dr. John for hours and hours and hours and hours. But into our segue, when you and I talked earlier this week, we were like informed consent. And for me, that's a fairly new term, right? Like what does that mean really? And I think kind of part of what you're speaking to starts to address what I have found about, so the organization I was a part of worked very, very hard, had whole departments and teams and whatnot that are there to suppress information. They are, so particularly after what happened in the 1990s with the 60 Minutes episode. So with the history of this particular organization, they had a big takedown, right? So that's a big takedown in 1991. This interview comes out, destroy. I mean, I heard Warner talk about it. He had a freak out in one of our sessions one time about this very thing, and, destroyed his reputation in his world. And then there was a massive fallout from that, as of course he left the country. The more I research it, I'm finding there's a lot more reasons than just that, but I'll write about that in a future book or something. But so there's this huge thing, and then they disappear him. So the organization gets sold over to the employees. So that's always what it said, the employees. Well, we would come to know, of course, the employees, the two people at the top, were his brother and his sister. And I'm going to be really honest, I never thought that was a problem. I'm like, okay, so it's his brother, because I'm also being fed a narrative that this was this takedown by the Scientologists and this whole story. And they get a graduate to write a book about that very thing. And I've read that book. I just read it again for the second time recently. And I was just struck by it. Was knowing how I know the inside apparatus now, I was like, whoa, they were feeding her the information with this sort of veil of autonomy. I mean, it's just very clearly the information is being really filtered out from a particular source. So just my point is to say there's huge lengths taken to shape in what is now the emerging internet world. I think we're back in 1992, 93, right? And I know of, there are teams of people whose job it is to keep track of how Warner's talked about on the internet and, try to counteract it. And it's a big campaign. And I don't know to what degree they're doing that now, because it's too big, right? It's too big. There's too many people talking. There's too many platforms where people are free to speak. So I'm just curious, why don't we just start first? Can you tell us just kind of the basics? Give us a really basic primer about what informed consent is for those of us that thought we were all super uber informed and researching and maybe didn't really understand what that was.
Sure. So informed consent very basically means that if a person's going to agree to do something, they need to have as much information as possible, the relevant information to make a decision that's informed, that's not based on inaccurate information or a lack of information. So if informed consent's a big thing in ethics when it comes to doing research, for example. So if I'm asking somebody to participate in a study that I'm doing, I'll say to them, this is how much time it's going to take. These are the potential risks. These are the possible benefits. This is how your information is going to be protected. This is who will have access to the information. So they really kind of know what they're getting into before they decide to participate. And that's really what informed consent is about.
Well, I think by those standards that, for sure, again, I have to just go to one of my direct experiences. Someday I'm going to not have to talk about Landmark. I'm so sorry. But that is where my direct experience is, and particularly my leadership and management experience being inside these kind of organizations. And anything I say, I don't think it's actually singular to Landmark, as you point out in your thesis. There's LifeSprings, there's Context. I think all these groups that came through that same lineage have, to varying degrees, a lot of the same practices. But Landmark has, when you register, they have a form, and they say, in fact, I got my forms recently, and it even names bipolar disorder. And it says, if you're doing this, program, you're signing up for this program and you have one of these disorders, we recommend that you not do it, or that you seek the counsel of your health professional. Now, back in my day, I will confess, there was whole teams that were like, oh yeah, you don't, go through that fast, because there's so much pressure for the result for the staff member. That's where the pickle comes for the staff members. And
I was going to actually ask
what do you
about
think
that,
about that?
because I think that there may be things, in place, but does the atmosphere at any given organization mean that some of those things are serving the purpose that they should be? And from what I understand, there is a lot of pressure to meet sales targets. So in those circumstances, to what degree are those things emphasized? Are they followed? Is a person asking the right questions about whether they should be participating or not? And I think that the concern that I've had generally when I've looked at large group awareness training is that idea of the first rule of large group awareness training is you don't talk about large group awareness training. And the thinking behind that is that often it's the case that a person will be told, don't tell the person any details about what happens in the seminar. It will spoil the experience for them. And I mean, this is something that Margaret Singer wrote about in Cults in Our Midst in chapter 8, when she has her chapter on LGATs. And I just see it over and over and over again. When people are being invited to participate in seminars, very often it seems that graduates have been explicitly instructed to not reveal details about what takes place. I don't know if that's necessarily the case in Landmark, but it's certainly something that I've seen coming up a lot. And additionally, the person that's often recruiting you is going to be in this elevated state of transformation. So they're going to be, this was the greatest thing ever. I can't tell you anything. You need to just trust me, take part, and it's somebody that somebody that you trust, somebody that you love, that's kind of saying that. And another thing that Daniel Kahneman comments on, and it's weird, he actually uses the term technology, but they've done studies when people believe more strongly in a technology, they also underestimate its risks. And so the primary person or the primary route that any new participant is getting information from is going to be from the person that is speaking to them. Is it likely that they're going to be conveying to them accurately the benefits? And are they going to be conveying to them accurately maybe what some of the risks or the downside is? And I'm not sure if that's going to be the case.
Well, to address what you said, I don't know that it's definitely not explicit, like, do not say this, but it's more in the realm of like, gosh, it's so magical, you can barely even explain it. So just share the magic and say, God, you got to come see it for yourself. It's like, if I were to go to a restaurant and describe in detail exactly how they make it or the taste. It's like, no, you got to taste it for yourself. Just come. It's amazing. Trust me, or the great movie. I don't want to spoil the ending, but man, you're going to love this movie, especially you, because you're a curious person. That's kind of the vibe of how it's presented. It's not so distinct or definitely not nefarious. Like you're not allowed to talk about it,
Well, I think though this is where I think the commodification of self-help and self-help have merged and it's led to a lot of, I don't know if they were intended or unintended, but consequences that are not healthy or safe. So, I've been in sales all my life. I had somebody take me under her wing when I was 20 years old and teach me sales because she said, if you know sales, you'll have a job, you'll be able to take care of yourself and your kids the rest of your life. And she was right. And, a salesperson, and I know this is, I led the leadership training program, the initial one in Landmark back in the 90s, like in, I don't know, 97, 98, like that. And, what we knew then, and it correlated with what was being taught in sales, which is people move off of experience. So your job is to create an experience. And if you talk about the stuff, so it's like, if I'm going to go to Mark's restaurant, I'm not going to say like, oh my gosh, it's so amazing. He makes lentil soup with lentils. And no. Sorry, Mark, I can't think of a recipe off the top of my head. But I have a very great one. You're not going to talk
about the ingredients. You're going to talk about the taste.
Well, although it's interesting because I'm leading facilitating and developing a safe practitioner workshop right now. And we're really examining how do we offer what we have to offer and be safe and ethical? That's what we're examining. And this is one of our big points is you do list the ingredients. Because if I go to a restaurant and I ate out yesterday, it says all the ingredients and I can ask my waiter, like, okay, what are the ingredients? And I agree with Mark. While it's not at one time, I think it was explicitly said quite a while ago to not particularly share things, but it was said in the context of don't share all that because it's just dry and boring. People aren't going to understand it. The forum is designed to be experienced. So you can't explain it to people. That's what we were told all the time, but it also doesn't have it's not just that it doesn't have a clear list of the ingredients because they now have the syllabus on their website, that has kind of like the basic things, but for me, what's missing is the lineage. So, and we discovered this, as we were talking it through with a bunch of practitioners from a whole bunch of modalities, that if you leave out the lineage, you're leaving out a really core piece, particularly if who's leading it does not have accepted, known credentials that have an accountability structure. So lawyers have an accountability structure, doctors have an accountability structure, psychologists have an accountability structure. Personal development coaches have no accountability structure, none, other than the market. So, now I'm kind of, I think of the Twin Flames thing. I watched that in horror, but I noticed that, this guy gets on and he's getting an audience and and he's promising that I am going to help you find your one. Then he's pinned by that promise. He has to make up crazier and crazier and crazier and crazier stuff to make that promise come true till we have what we have today in that cult, which is people are literally doing sex change operations to match what the guru said was their match. And he's assigning people the role and the relationship, the whole thing. But it all stems from making this grandiose promise. There's no information, there's no credibility, there's no lineage to his background other than, I've trained, I've done all this stuff. And these are the kinds of things that people report, which all happen to be people who are mostly in a heightened or altered state. So anyway, so when we think about informed consent, I think it's a little bit bigger than just the exact things that are in it.
Yes. So, I mean, I think that some of the things that are maybe relevant is trying to understand the likely benefits and maybe understanding some of what the risks are. And so you have to ask yourself, I mean, if I go onto, I don't know if it's still like that, but when I used to go onto the Landmark site, it said 94% of people report, positive lasting change.
I have it up over here. I'll look.
There were two studies that mentioned that. So there was the Yanklevich study, and then there was something called the IMC report, and both of them mention a 94% rate of lasting effectiveness. You've been in the space before. I don't know if that's accurate or not. As an outsider, what I would say is 94% sounds very, very high. It also sounds very consistent for two separate studies to have that same level of lasting effectiveness. If I'm evaluating a study, so say somebody sends me a journal article and I want to review it, I want to look at the methodology, I want to see how they've done it, who did they speak to, who did they gather the information from, because results can be distorted. And so if I'm looking at any of the studies that were sitting on the landmark site, none of them have been published in an academic journal. There's no methodology there. So it's very difficult for me to work out whether I think the results are believable or not. So I think that's an issue. So if you're saying 94%, a person that's going to make an informed decision about participating, if they think, well, there's a 94% chance that I'm going to have lasting benefit from this, that's going to play into their decision making. And I would question whether that figure is backed up by evidence or not. I would say that given the claims that LGATs tend to make, they make claims like 94% effectiveness and lasting effectiveness. These are things that can be empirically tested. So if you are running an organization where there is skepticism about the effectiveness of the organization, why not conduct a high-quality study, publish it in an academic journal, and remove the skepticism? So these organizations have been around for 50 years. And so you ask yourself, well, have there been any high-quality studies done? Well, actually, there was one done. There was one done in 1989. It was done on the forum. It was done with the support of Werner Earhart and Associates. They cited on the study, it's an article by Fisher et al. Called Psychological Effects of Participation in a Large Group Awareness Training. And it was a really well-designed study. There was a quasi-experimental design. My students will understand what that means. But basically, it means that they compared a big group of people that were taking part in the forum to a big group of similar people in terms of age and socioeconomic status and gender and income. So they matched these two groups to each other, and they wanted to find out if there were any short-term benefits or disadvantages from participation and any long-term benefits or disadvantages from participation. And they found that in the short term, which was about 6 weeks later, so if there is the sort of transformation, which tends to last, a couple of weeks maybe, it probably wouldn't have shown up in the short-term results 6 weeks afterwards. They found a slight difference. They had 11 different measures. One of the measures that they found a slight benefit was that people had more of an internal locus of control. So basically, this means that participants tended to feel that they were more in control over things, good and bad in their lives. So I'm more responsible if things go bad, and I'm more, to be celebrated when things go well. And it was a small difference. And then there was actually a small disadvantage on one of the other measures. So people that had been through the forum tended to report more daily hassles than people that hadn't been. They got annoyed with certain things. And then long term, which was 18 months later, they found no difference at all between these two groups. And so this is a very well-designed study that was published in a journal. I think that the authors, won an award for the quality of the study. And, as somebody who's done research and lectures research, you look at it, this was a very well put together study. That information's not on the website. The published studies not on the website. So I don't know, you might argue, well, that was before it became Landmark. 1989 was a different organization. But in terms of informed consent, if somebody's going to make a decision about participating, then I would think that both of those things are relevant. And I can hear people that are pro-landmark watching this and kind of going, but I got amazing benefit out of it. Awesome. I think that that's fantastic. But then I think that there is a responsibility to demonstrate it in some way.
Yeah.
Do
this
the
is Rick
research,
Ross's.
demonstrate that it's the case.
That was one of his
think
primary things, is that they could be doing a study. I mean, they could have long since they could do it right now. But it does, I just want to underline and highlight and circle the thing that you're pointing to. And not because I have an axe to grind, but because I found it shocking for myself as an insider. But that as I started to research and think and look, and I'm a big health person, so I'm one of those people that reads the New York Times article headline and I like click to the JAMA study, I click to the Journal of American Medicine study and I read it, and all this stuff, and to see that a lot of these studies, like the Yankovic, there was no control group, there's no comparison. And I was even a part of this absolutely brilliant woman who is a well-renowned scientist who does these kind of studies. She did do an attempt to do a study on the Being a Leader course, but when I thought back over it, I was like, oh, whoa. And I really admired the work she was doing, where she was tracking people, exactly like you said, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, but there was no control group. There was no contrast to compare. So that meant any result is really entirely subjective to those people. Like there's no, I mean, this is why we call our show Confronting the Line, because on the line between light and dark, you can see both and you can see whole bunches of stuff. But if you're all in the dark or all in the light, you can't see much. You can only see what you already sort of know. And I think that's a big problem with our research in these days, is what's good research?
I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily easy to do, but other things have been studied. And it's not like you're trying to understand psychodynamic therapy, which tends to take place over years, so multiple confounding variables creep in. It's similar to looking at cognitive therapy, which tends to happen over a relatively short period of time. You know what you expect the outcomes to be, so you can measure them. And I think that it's unreasonable for people that are maybe supporters of a given organization to be upset with my skepticism. Because I do think that these are things that can be assessed. They can be measured, and it allows people to make an informed decision about whether they want to participate or not.
Well, plus, what do you say about all the information that's hit? So another thing that has been surprising to me, I did not, the day I published my book, I was was a little bit on Team Landmark, actually. I was like, hey, they just got to clean up these old-fashioned bad business practices that I sort of laid right at the feet of the founder. And let's be clear, what I was exposing was that the founder never fully left, that the founder, the source, as he's known in our community, has fully been involved. And in fact, in 2015, 2016, started going back in training the forum leaders, just really bringing back all deeply and directly, all of the training, all of the ideas. I mean, I saw it. I sat in rooms while they worked on the distinctions that are in the forum. Somebody I spoke with as recently as a couple of weeks ago shared they were working in world headquarters up until 2 years ago. No, it wasn't even that long ago. And every time there was a Landmark forum, Werner was getting a check. He was getting a wire transfer, because the only way that's happening is because he's consulting on the work itself. That's how that's happening. And I don't even particularly have okay, so that's happening. Now, none of that really bothered me until I found the website that started to show all the many lawsuits of people who have family members who have filed suit because their loved one committed suicide following the forum, or committed some kind of heinous act following their, directly following their participation. And then I've lost track of the employment lawsuits now, which confirmed what I sort of suspected, which the work environment is dangerous. I went looking for good news, not bad news. And I keep finding bad news, and it's pretty upsetting, actually. And
I think it is about trying to understand the positives and the negatives. And this is not to say that there aren't positives. Clearly people are getting value out of it. but let's try to get an understanding of how likely that is. Is it long lasting? What exactly it is? I think that would be really useful. And then, as you say, if there are negative results for some people, also let's try to get an understanding of that. So in the disclaimer, I think it says like very bad reactions, it's 1,000th of 1%. So that's 1 in every 100,000 people. And so if you're reading that, you think to yourself, I mean, that's almost a zero chance of, I mean, it's not exactly clear what these very bad reactions are. But it does seem incredibly remote. And so again, if you've got an exaggerated sense of what the benefits are going to be, and maybe an understated sense of what the risks are, and I'm not sure, maybe that's an accurate figure. I don't know the detail, but I think that those things are important. I have also found, and I mean, whether you want to cut this out or not, I found one or two things that I think are quite misleading. So, for example, I was watching something called Conversations on Compassion with Werner Erhard. This was when he was sitting with James Doty, who's a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University. And this was maybe in 2017, I think this was uploaded.
It was a big it was a big splash when I was trying to sell the Being a Leader course, because it was like, oh, he was with Doty, and yeah.
Well, the thing is that because of the work that I've done, I've interacted with a lot of people who are who've taken part in Landmark or taken part in various other organizations, and we've often had like really enjoyable conversations. And one of the people that I spoke to said, well, I mean, she was a little bit upset with me, but she said, what do you know? A professor of neurosurgery at Stanford says that, it's incredibly effective. And so I said, okay, well, that's interesting. Let me go and have a look at this. And this is after I'd completed my PhD. So James Doty is a very impressive character, and Erhard, emphasizes that fact. He says, please go and look at him online. He's this incredible person. He runs the CARE Foundation or something at Stanford. You'll see pictures of him hugging the Dalai Lama online. And I mean, clearly a professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University is very impressive from an authority perspective. He said something that I didn't agree with. And so I've actually got a chart. I'll read out what he says. He said, and if you followed EST, if you've seen the power of the Landmark Forum, even today, where hundreds of thousands of lives are changed, you'll understand this. Innumerable studies have been done that have demonstrated very scientifically the extraordinary positive effect that EST and these types of trainings have really had on people and changed really millions of lives. And so that's a very specific claim. He's saying that there have been these innumerable scientific studies that have demonstrated this. I would think that scientific studies, the best ones, would be published on the Landmark website. None of those studies have been peer-reviewed. If you're a professor at Stanford University, you know that a very scientific study is a peer-reviewed study with a very strong methodology, etc. So I contacted him and I said to him, I've just watched this thing. You've claimed that there's these innumerable studies, and I quoted what he'd said. And I'll tell you what he said back to me. He said, it took a while to get back to me. Clearly, he wasn't very happy about the question. But he said, no studies have yet been completed, so there's nothing published, as well as the final study design and sign-off is not complete. I'm not sure where you found the quote, demonstrated very scientifically the positive effect that EST and these types of trainings have on people. It was not from me. I know of no such study, only anecdotal statements. And then he sent me another email a little bit later on that said, if your quote is from me, which I don't recall, it was not true. And so to me, this stands in the way of informed consent. You've got to, if you don't know what something involves, and it's quite complicated, it's hard to research, and you've got a person with that level of authority telling you that innumerable scientific studies have been done that have demonstrated very clearly the positive effect that it has, you'll be like, great. Why should I go and research it if this person is
Mhm.
is vouching for it. And for him to say that he doesn't, that's not actually true at all, it's not like he's ever stood up and said, actually, that was not true. So that information's sitting out there. I've got people coming to me and telling me that they've heard this and they believe
Yeah.
it. They're going to be telling other people that are going to participate based on that information. This is not to say that the forum is not going to add value to somebody's life. It is to say that that bit of information, saying that it's been scientifically demonstrated in innumerable studies, that part is not true. And I think that is a
I
big
mean, it just
problem when it
reeks
comes
of
to
chutzpah, right? Like the chutzpah it takes to say innumerable. You could just say studies have shown, but to actually throw in the word innumerable is like,
And I mean,
take
to
some
even use
cojones.
the term demonstrated very scientifically, it's not a professor at a university like that understands what that means. So to me, that's misleading.
Be interested to get your take on this. The, that whole 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, right? And the average person would go, "Oh, okay, well, that's not going to be me. I'm not going to be the one," right? I mean, we rationalize that, or we're hopeful, or we just, we've never had an incident, so we think that's not going to be me. But it reminds me of something that happened to me in a completely different realm. I was years and years and years ago, I was going to take a 2-month trip all around Southeast Asia, and my doctor said, "Well, okay, you better take an anti-malarial." Just to be safe. And, it turns out I wasn't even, planning on going deep into the jungle or anything. I was going to like, Singapore or Kuala Lumpur. I was going to the cities, but he's like, you got to
Yeah.
take this thing because it's important. You might get malaria. And, I was given Lariam, which is, mefloquine. It's this, and I didn't know until much later that I wouldn't say innumerable, but a lot of incidents of problems, particularly people in the Peace Corps or people in the military who found out, you got a little bit, had crazy dreams the night after you took the pill each week, right? And
Yeah.
I had this extreme reaction. I was in a hotel room in Bangkok freaking out, right? Like I had a total freak out. It was completely unlike me. I called my boyfriend. I was like saying he says, you never talk this way. This is really strange. Like you're usually really, rational, I guess, for lack of a better word. Right. And I was having harm ideation, I will call it, right? Self-harm ideation, which had never happened to me before. And I come to find out, I didn't know anything about it. And I looked on the internet, like, what the heck? And I started typing in these things and I was like, well, let me type in the pills I've been taking. And all of these things came up on the internet about reactions. And I'm like, I had no idea. My doctor just said, take these pills, you should take it. And I took it. And the salient point is that it said it's contraindicated for people with a history of neuropsychiatric disorder.
Yeah.
So even if I had seen that, I would have said, well, that's not me. I've never had any kind of break, anything like that. I've never been in treatment for anything like that. I'll be fine too. Like I probably still would have taken it, even if I had known that, and I didn't know that. But come to find out, well, you could still have the reaction, even if you're not in that group, right? And that was me. And it took me I literally cut my trip short. I came home. I had to completely change my diet and my lifestyle, and it took me months to recover from that experience. And, I chalked it up to, well, I guess, I'm not blaming anyone, but it's like, wow, I was the 1 in 10,000 in that instance.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I didn't fall into the category, right? So I wonder if just as human beings, we're hopeful and we think, well, that's not going to be me.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the case, and I also do think that there aren't things that are without risk. So I do think that sometimes the risk is worth it, but it's about having I mean, if you are given the right information and you make the decision, then it's on you. I think the question has to be asked, so where did that 1 in 100,000 come from? Is there any rigorous process of recording these things, of keeping these records, of following up on people, after participation? I'm not sure if that's the case. I mean, you can maybe tell me. So I don't know where that figure's coming from. I don't know where the 94% is coming from. If you read, for example, I think the Yankelovich study, it says that people said that they felt that the participation would have lasting benefits for them. So does that mean that they were asked quite soon after participating, in a month, or after 2 months? Like, So how do you work out lasting transformation? It's very difficult to do longitudinal type of studies when you're measuring people a year later, 2 years, 3 years later. Those are very difficult studies to do. So somebody, again, who lectures research, whenever I hear a statistic, I always think to myself, how would they have worked this out? And I'm hopefully getting my students to do that as well. So it's kind of like, if somebody makes a claim about anything, I'm like, how would they have done that study? And, you know, that's where
you're
my
introducing, you're talking about what I call, I'm learning about real critical thinking, because I thought, I started participating in Landmark when I was like 26, 27, something like that. And pretty much my life up until then had been about raw survival. I had a child when I was 15. I had my second, child when I'm like 22, and bad marriage, and just really raw survival. And and then I find this thing, and it made a difference. I did divorce. I did it. I did divorce, and that turned out to be a good thing. And although,
I did notice on
and then
a previous podcast, one of your guests mentioned that that his wife divorced him immediately after participating, and I thought, well, that's interesting. That's exactly what I
right. She actually told him.
Kind of noticed.
She actually the way he shared it is, she came back from the S training and she said, "This thing's amazing. You have to do it, and I'm leaving you." Like, and right, kind of thing. So I appreciate. It feels a little bit like a crapshoot. But there is something, and then I participated, and that was pretty much my whole life until 2012 when I left Landmark. But I didn't really leave, because I went on to host Werner, right? I went on to, participate, in the outer sphere, which is the way it goes for a lot of people who do long-term participation in a group like that. Then you go to work for one of those consulting companies, or all that kind of stuff. So I would say I didn't really leave, honestly, until 2020, when they kind of kicked me out, because they threatened me. They said, "Oh, if we're done. Basically, we're done with you. You're not hosting for Werner anymore. So you're done." And, and they threatened me with, if you do business, and anybody who, does Landmark programs, registers in your programs, that you're violating, blah, blah, blah. Like, they threatened me. And it was really heartbreaking. But even that still wasn't enough to kind of go, it was then they started threatening the people who were looking at doing business with me, because I wasn't interested in redoing Landmark. I was actually still on the team called, "Hey, maybe I can do something out here that will help funnel more people to Landmark." I was still very much on team Landmark, and but I was not in their direct control anymore. I was now in this outer ring. And but it's interesting. I can see how important it is to our own thinking too, to kind of move out, because it was as I moved out. I had asked you earlier a question about, okay, why is it that you are investigating what you're investigating, I'm investigating, and really are just investigating to learn, and we don't look away from when what we learn is bad news? Like, why do some people look away when it's bad news, and some people look to sort of rationalize it or justify it or whatever? But I think this thing about the further away you are from the immediate experience, because I don't think it was really when a reporter started asking me questions, and I heard myself talking to him as a total outsider, completely curious, had no axe to grind, no nothing, just really curious. And I started to hear myself talk, and I went, "Oh, that's kind of weird. Well, that's kind of weird. Well, why is that weird?" And I started investigating, and I started looking, and I started reading, and then I was watching other things too. And I'm like, wait, that crazy thing they're talking about at Nexium, that's kind of familiar,
Well, I think that's the comment that we made earlier about social identity plays a big role. And,
yeah,
I think Chris Shelton used a nice term. I think it was weaponized empath or something like that. And I made the same comments in my PhD, is that it's the goodness in people that makes them want to be a part of an organization that is doing something good. So you want to do something you want to do something really good. So I know that there's a group of people that are kind of feeling like, well, why was I involved for so long? And they may feel bad about it. And my kind of view on it is, you are willing to work really long hours. You're willing to not get paid incredibly well. You're willing to maybe do that job at the same time as you're doing another job. It wasn't for your own benefits. I mean, other than the benefits of feeling like you were doing something useful and good. So, like, to me, there's that aspect to it. In terms of why some people choose to look at something in one way versus another, I think that a lot of it has got to do with what you are exposed to. So if you are taking part, if you're involved in an LGAT organization, and the people that you see are the people that maybe really enjoyed the experience, that maybe signed up for the next seminar, those are people that likely had a really good experience. And so the conversation around participation is going to be very positive. You're getting a selective sample. You may not be seeing people that had not such great experiences. And the thing is that there are those people out there. And so maybe somebody doesn't want to acknowledge that, because as soon as they started acknowledging that, it's going to like ruin their entire thing. But you don't have to read my work. You can literally just type in, go to a discussion forum, whether it's Reddit or whether it's Quora or whether it's whatever, and you'll get very extreme views on most of these organizations. They're either going to be people that are saying this is the greatest thing ever, or they're going to be people that are saying I had a negative experience. And I'm I can't challenge anyone that says that I had an amazing experience and it led to all these positive changes in my life. It helped me improve my relationship with my mother or father. I don't want to like put a dent in that. If that's been incredible for you, then that's amazing. I do have a concern when people say this works for everyone, and that is often the way that people that really believe in some of these seminars will speak about. They'll say it works for everyone, and I think objectively that's not true. And it's not just a tiny group of people that are upset that are speaking about it. It is a lot of people. I don't know what percentage it is. The study hasn't been done, but go online and you will hear a number of people saying, either this person that I know got so involved that and spoke about this thing so much that we just couldn't deal with them anymore. It was just every conversation. It ruined relationships within a family because somebody became so pro it. And you hear these kinds of things. And this is not talking about somebody having a psychotic break or suicide. I mean, those are very extreme possible examples. These are just more everyday examples of people saying, this didn't affect my life in a good way. And it may not be the person that participated. It may be a family member or friend who says, this person is not the good version of themselves that they think they are. They seem to think that they're amazing and transformed and whatever, but the rest of us don't see it in the same way as them. And those are important things to think about. And so those are some of the concerns that I have. And I mean, I deal with the mother who's had the really bad reaction with the child, or the brother who's no longer speaking to somebody, or the husband whose wife has left him or whatever. These are the conversations that I have. And I've also got a distorted sample. So I'm hearing a lot of the negative stories. And so I try to open myself and listen to what the positives were. But I do think there has to be the courage to kind of look and say, well, what are the good things? What are the bad things? And
I think
who does it work and who doesn't it?
I think Mark and I can relate, because now that we've said publicly, like, hey, maybe there's some bad things too. We don't even say, we say there's a lot of good things. We've been talking about those for years, but there's a few bad things we've noticed. In a cost benefit analysis, as I look back, I don't know, like the scale is really tipping, because I'm seeing too that one of the biggest costs of my deep participation that I had never recognized isn't what I did and got, it's what I didn't do and didn't get. Because that's another aspect. It's not just that, like, this is the answer for all things, this is the only answer, which is said directly or implied. So, you know, my husband and I met him. He was actually my registration manager when I led the Introduction Leaders program. Like, we had a whole landmark wedding, or it was fabulous and it was great. But I'll tell you, we're still married, honestly, because of the family therapist that we started working with during the pandemic, because we never really had to fully live together until the pandemic, because one of us was always traveling and somebody was always on the move. And then all of a sudden we found, like, whoa, all the tools that we had that we thought made us like the best of the best at relationships were not working at all. And, thank God I have the kind of husband that's a lifelong learner like me. And we went to a family systems therapist, and we started working, and all kinds of stuff's happened in our family. But, as I've gotten away and I look back at these results, I've had amazing experiences. I know I've made a difference in people's lives. That's the other part, Dr. John, that's a little hard to hold, is, I think you do authentically make a difference in people's lives while you're there and leading. For sure. I mean, what we have to deal with is both things can be true. I can make that big difference for those participants. I mean, I'm still in touch with many of them, but I did that, and I cost myself and my daughter and my family a lot. I'm 55 years old. For me to go back and get an education now, I figured it out the other day, I would be 61 before I could get a degree. And, and then you go out and you start I did this and and you can claim your experience, but as soon as somebody says, where'd you get it from? And they look at it and you go, oh, literally, I've had people say this, oh, isn't that a cult? And I'm like, well, I mean, I used to say no. Now I'm kind of like, kind of. And, so when you get away, when you get ejected or rejected, or you walk away, Mark is one of the few that I've talked to that walked away, that's when you start to see and you start to examine. And that's just kind of a little too late. Like, I would like to encourage people to examine more at the front side, and to really, and unfortunately right now you do have to really dig and do some deep work and thinking. And then even if you do go ahead and do the forum, people ask me all the time. Somebody asked me yesterday, would you recommend the forum to somebody? Now, when my book was published, I said yes. Now I say no. And I say no simply because I've heard from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who they enjoyed their experience. Many of them, most of them enjoyed their experience. And yet in the end of a cost benefit analysis on the other side, with the benefit of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they're kind of like, well, it was a good experience, but all these other things that I didn't do while I was doing that, particularly for people that got deeply involved. There's a whole string going on in one of our groups about literally people are just, for the first time ever, saying, yeah, when I started Landmark, I had an offer to be a vice president at Wells Fargo. And now I'm, 20 years later, I'm a shift manager at Starbucks. I don't think that equals, this to the promise that programs like this make.
Well, I think, I don't know if we've spoken about it before, but I do think that there's a place for personal development. I think that psychology is lacking something. I mean, it's very expensive. It's not accessible to most people, and there can be huge benefits.
It takes a long time.
It takes a long time, and some of that's got to do with the ethics of it. The fact that it is regulated and that everything has to be done very carefully so that there aren't any risks. And maybe it's a little bit too conservative at times. I do think that there's certainly things that people can learn in groups together that can add massive value to them. I suppose, and I don't know exactly what takes place in all of the seminars offered by Landmark or by other organizations, but I guess it's about figuring out what are the things that really do add value. Like, let's look at the parts that
Yeah.
maybe are potentially causing risk, and is there a way to either minimize that risk or make people more aware of what the risks might be? Because I mean, you might think that I just want to get rid of LGATs. That's not my view. Is
Yeah.
people need to make decisions for themselves. They need to be responsible, but they need as much information as possible to make those decisions. If they're given misleading information and they take part in something, that's when I feel like there's an issue. So I think that these conversations are hugely valuable. Hopefully, it opens up somebody to kind of go, well, let me look into this
Right.
a little bit more. I'm not of the idea of banning anything. That quotes, if you don't believe in freedom of speech for people you despise, then you don't believe in it at all. And that's my kind of view on all these things. So you have to be willing to kind of say, you tell us everything that you want to say, and we'll tell you everything from our perspective. And then when all that information's floating around, other people can look at both sides and make an informed choice about what their view is going to be.
Here. I agree. I couldn't possibly agree more. And this is probably a good time to sort of start to wrap up this section. But because what I've seen, I wanted to get into talking about seeking safely. I'm not talking about in this interview, but overall. But since my book came out, what I found was that we need more space and time to talk. A lot that has been suppressed needs the opportunity to come up and be said and be voiced, so that the very people that I think can help us create a safer, more ethical personal development space can do so with the information, not just with what was good, but also what was dangerous, so that we can really do better. I love Sarah Edmondson says all the time, she says this great thing is, one, if it was all bad, none of us would have ever done it, like that. And it's not, there's good stuff in there. There's good wisdom, and it's useful. Like you said, it's accessible. It's, it's so important. And, but our measure is when we find out the bad stuff, are we willing to look, and are we then willing to take what we learn and do better? And that's really my commitment, is that we learn everything we can learn so that we can do better, because there's a huge need. There's a huge need on this planet for people to introspect, to grow, to learn, to explore spiritually, emotionally, physically, all of that. And I've come to see, I've participated in other groups that are really healthy and that are really great. I don't have to do the whole pain to pleasure thing. That was what I discovered I was quite addicted to, was the whole I'm an asshole, my life doesn't work, and that's the best news I've ever heard, because now I can, this sort of rise to fall thing. And now I do personal development work where none of that's required. And I just get the nice, I come out and I go, whoa, I come out with powerful insights and opportunities to take new action. And we can, I can go find other trainings that help me with the further skills I need to move forward the thing I discovered. And they're not all trying to kill each other with lawsuits and threats of intellectual property fights. And, there's a whole other world available, I swear, if we can just stop, take a breath, release what has been hurting, and really look and have these kind of conversations. So I just really appreciate you coming to the line with us today. That's kind of our thing. We're not so, sure. Confronting the line is the confront part is more about being willing to confront ourselves and our strongly held opinions and beliefs. Are we willing to see even when we don't like what we see? That's what the confront part is about. The line is about simply being able to see. On the line, we can see more.
Right.
Yeah.
And in line with what you're saying, I'd like to maybe just end off with it's a quote from a book called The Wisest One in the Room by two social psychologists, Gilovich and Ross. And it's maybe because I'm preempting some of the comments that might come from some people, having conversations with people that have participated in any LGATs. Often they'll say, you've never participated in this one, so you've got no room to to make
Right.
a comment about it. And that's because experience is emphasized so much. And you can watch my video with John Atack, where I think it's called Why We Don't Always Look Before We Leap.
It's
And
a
it
really
speaks
good.
about, yeah, so it speaks about the way that experience is emphasized, analyzing is often de-emphasized, and then this powerful experience is triggered, and that becomes the evidence of the efficacy of the thing. So the quote is this. So it says, a wise person, in contrast, recognizes that there are two sides of every coin. A vantage point that makes some things easy to see can obscure considerations that would be obvious from another perspective. And the point that I'm kind of making is that I haven't participated perhaps in the seminar that you participated in. I have participated in something that had very similar roots to, I'd say, most people that have participated in,
It's very
in an
close.
LGAT. But from personal participation, some things are very clear. The experience is very clear. What's kind of going on is very clear, but it might be the most compromised perspective from which to understand other things that are going on.
Mhm.
And as you sort of said earlier, and that ability to kind of take a step back and go, okay, I'm going to put that over there away from me, and I'm going to look at it from somebody else's perspective. I'm going to try on these other views. I'm going to consider what has to be said. And I'm going to be aware that maybe acknowledging some of these things may affect my social identity. It may affect my sense of self. And that's going to unconsciously make it difficult for me to maybe agree with this. The end result might be you look at this information, you read my work, and you still think this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He's a psychotic, bipolar person. It'll be very easy to dismiss what I'm saying. So I won't be offended if that's the case. But if you are interested and you'd like to look at another perspective, then it is there. And you're welcome to contact me. If I have the capacity, I'll respond. I do have another job, but I'll do what I can. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
and
you
Dr.
do
John,
have.
why don't you go ahead and then mention your website so that people can take a look there?
Okay. Yeah. So you can find my PhD. You can find a bunch of podcasts at johnhunterphd.com. I think there's another one coming out in October, I know, with Rachel Bernstein. I had a chat with her a little while ago, but I think that she's got a bit of a backlog, so that'll be coming out sometime soon. Otherwise, they'll be uploaded on my site, or just search for my work on YouTube, and you should find something hopefully mildly interesting to watch.
Thank you. All right. So we want to thank you very much for that. And it's been great talking with you today. I know people have just a wealth of information to look at, and really an interesting perspective that is unique. As I mentioned, it's pretty unique for you to be a person with the credentials you have, but also the experience you have. So we want to thank you for joining us here on Confronting the Line today. And we will see you next time.